Now, when asked about whether that meant boots on the ground, the outgoing Prime Minister had this to say.
We know we're going to have to continue to do more and more in an uncertain world, and Canada will be there. As to how we will be there, we will work with our neighbours on it, but everything is on the table because we need to make sure that might no longer makes right in this world.
For more on this, Melanie Joly is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Hi, Minister. Pleasure to welcome you back to our show. Thank you very much for making the time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Vashi.
I wanted to start off on a couple of questions the Prime Minister got today about the prospect of Canadian boots on the ground in Ukraine and ask you to be explicit. Is that something your government is considering, and if so, when?
Well, first and foremost, the Prime Minister said everything was on the table. And it's true. Now, why I can't give you more information on that very question is things are very fluid. I'm in London right now. I just had a meeting with some key British leaders, including the national security advisors. I was just in France last week talking with the foreign minister and the national security advisor. And I've been in touch also with the Americans. So there are lots of things that are happening, lots of conversations that are happening. Definitely the future of Ukraine is being discussed, but we need to make sure that Ukrainians are at the table, and we need to make sure that they have a say in what is coming next for their country and for the relationship between Ukraine, Europe, and us. So that's why this is the information I can give you at this point.
And I certainly do acknowledge the fluidity of this moment where Ukraine is concerned. I think, though, for Canadians who will have heard the Prime Minister today, they are very curious about what lines in principle your government would draw. So I understand that you can't know for sure what's about to happen. But for example, if there, is peace in Ukraine, is it something that after that is secured, Canadian troops would be potentially a part of, or is it a peace process throughout that Canadian troops could be a part of? Because the Prime Minister intimated both at different times today.
Well, I think when we think about what's the future of Ukraine, first and foremost, what we all agree on within the G7, so the Americans, Europe, us, is we need to offer security guarantees to Ukraine to make sure that ultimately when the war ends, because it will end at one point, there will be a diplomatic solution, that President Putin cannot leave, rearm, and reinvade. Because if that's the case, we know that not only Ukraine's, as a country is at stake, but we know that President Putin has no red lines, and he could further go into NATO territory. And we know also that China and Russia are participating together in military cooperation in the Arctic, and that's also an issue for us. So the question is, what do security guarantees mean? What would be the involvement of Europeans? What would be the involvement of Americans? What would be the involvement of us? And this is the conversation we're having. All the different countries that have participated in supporting Ukraine right now through military aid, through financial aid, are all right now talking with the Americans to see what we could do to help to stabilize the situation, but fundamentally to make sure that Ukraine is not reinvaded and that NATO territory is safe.
You included the Americans in the group of countries you said want to see security guaranteed for Ukraine. Why do you have that impression when the President of the United States is specifically saying Ukraine started the war?
Well, of course, first and foremost, on that narrative, we disagree. And we think that too many times in every war, the truth is a casualty. And the truth is Russia invaded Ukraine against the UN Charter, against its territorial integrity. And since then, Ukrainians have been fighting for their freedom, but also for ours. Now, in terms of security guarantees, why I'm talking to you about that, it is because we held a first foreign ministers meeting of the G7 in Munich a week ago. And Canada was, for the first time, the chair of the G7, and I chaired that meeting. Out of that meeting came out a statement, and that statement clearly outlined that all G7 countries agreed that Ukraine needed security guarantees. And this is also consistent from what we're hearing from the Americans. So based on that, that's why I'm referring to that concept of security guarantees. And what is being discussed as we speak is what does that mean? What's the what types of guarantees are strong enough to make sure that there is a true deterrence impact against Ukraine, against Russia, and how can ultimately we be united in that way of ultimately protecting Europe and also protecting NATO.
And I understand that it was part of the communique and the statement that emerged from that meeting. But since then, what we've heard from the president, like you said, is the false accusation that Ukraine started this war. From the defense minister, the fact that he's already taken off what would have been the most secure guarantee of security for Ukraine, which is membership in NATO. So in realistic terms, why would you believe that Americans are at all interested in what you and your allies are laying out?
Well, when you say you and your allies, it's actually Canada and all our allies. So this is an important precision. But I must say that, well, when it comes to the U.S., we don't have the same, we don't agree with their approach that Russia is not an aggressor. We think that it is absolutely not the case. I think that when it comes to the position of the U.S., we understand that it has changed and we take stock of that. But in terms of Canada's position, we remain committed to the same principles. And we remain committed to the fact that countries need to follow the rules that have kept us safe since the Second World War now. We understand that there are conversations happening on what's the future of Ukraine and how we can make sure that we are able to bring back peace to Europe. And these conversations are important. But that's why Canada, and I'm here in Europe. I've been here for 2 weeks. I've been to Paris. I've been to Germany and Munich. I've been to Brussels and the EU. And now I'm here in London, making sure we have the same understanding with our allies and making sure also that we can bring the Americans on board. But the issue of security guarantees is not something that is surprising. Canadians watching us right now, Vashi, should not be surprised because this is consistent with all the conversations we've had, not only Canada and the U.S., but also many of our European allies with the U.S.
And certainly, I'm not casting aspersions on the Canadian position or our allies in the view that they've taken on guaranteeing security for Ukraine or even the war itself. But I think, you know, for people who have listened to Donald Trump over the last 10 days on Ukraine, the way in which he has allied himself in the United States with Putin is not just something that can be easily dismissed. Why do you believe, like what information do you have that we don't, that the Americans can still get on board with anything that Canada is espousing when it comes to Ukraine? Like what do you know that we don't?
Well, so Vashi, I think first and foremost, in terms of asking questions to the Americans, if you want to ask them questions, you can. What I'm telling you is based on the information.
You're saying that they can get on board.
But I just want to finish my answer, just a second. We've been able to get a consensus on the importance of security guarantees. Today, the Prime Minister was in Kyiv, along with many other G7 leaders, and President Trump participated. So I think that was a constructive dialogue, and we need to continue to engage on that. Meanwhile, you know, President Trump himself knows that he cannot get a bad deal, because if that's the case, that would be not necessarily positive for the Americans. But fundamentally, our job, being an ally of also Ukraine and of the Europeans, is to make sure that we set a precedent for Ukraine that will be a strong one, because it won't put our own security at stake, because it will ultimately recognize that there are principles that must be defended and must be abided to. So that's our job. Right now, I would love to answer you more clearly your questions, but right now it is important that diplomacy sometimes needs to remain private in order to be extremely effective. But I must say, I've been a foreign minister for 3.5 years, and the level of fluidity of negotiations have never been so high. So I'm giving you the information I can give you. And for Canadians watching us at home, please be assured that Canada's interests are being defended, and we're at the table when it comes to the future of Europe and NATO.
What is the prospect, Minister, in your view? The Prime Minister didn't directly address this in his remarks today, or what is the position, I should say, of Canada on Ukraine becoming a member of NATO? As I mentioned, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, already said the United States would not support that. Does Canada still support Ukraine's membership in NATO?
Yeah, our position, Vashti, has not changed. We believe that the best security guarantee, to your point a bit earlier, is the fact that Ukraine should be part of NATO when conditions allow. And we've been saying that, and I've been saying that for now 3 years and a half. This is something that President Zelensky has been clear about. I've been doing at least 3 NATO summits, and every time Canada's position was the same.
Do you think, Minister, that NATO is what it was, let's say, even 3 months ago? And I ask against the backdrop of, obviously, if Ukraine were a member of NATO, an attack on them would be an attack on everyone. Right now, we have Donald Trump threatening Canada, threatening Denmark, aligning himself with Russia, obviously an adversary of NATO allies. Do you think that axiom, you know, if an attack on one is an attack on all of us, is still what it is, like what it was today?
Well, you know, Canada's position will always be that Article 5, which you're saying an attack on one is an attack on all, is the very principle of NATO. And we understand that we need to invest more in defense and that we need to do our part. And I've said to you in many interviews that you asked me questions about, you know, I'm quite hawkish on this. It's not doing it for the Americans. It's actually doing it for us, because being foreign minister for quite a while now, I've seen how much the world is a much more dangerous place, and we need to be able to protect ourselves. Now, we also understand that there's a level of unpredictability coming from the White House. We know also that there are different positions that we may agree and we may disagree. And that's new for us. We're living in a new world. And my job also being in Europe has been to explain to many of my colleagues what is the reality dealing with the US now? What is this new administration? What are they saying? How is American society reacting? How is Congress reacting? What is how we should work more together, more than ever, to foster not only, you know, partnerships, but much more strength to it. That's why I'm in London right now. That's why I'm in the UK, because I think that ultimately Canadians need to know that they're not alone. And that we have many friends and allies, and we're facing this reality, all of us together.
But if the very principle, as you described it, that underpins NATO is one that one of our biggest former allies, if you could call it that, the U.S. no longer adheres to, what is NATO?
Well, NATO is a very important security alliance, defense alliance, and it has kept us safe, including America, including all of us. And it is the strongest and most successful military alliance in history. So we need to keep it strong, and we'll play our part for sure.
Do you think it will stay strong, given what I just laid out?
I'm an optimistic, but what I'm hearing also is in Europe is from leaders is they know they need to up their game. They need to do more. And meanwhile, the U.S. is preoccupied by threats coming on the Pacific front from China, and it is important that we do more together. And that's why also we came up with an Indo-Pacific strategy that had more military assets being in the Indo-Pacific. So things are moving very fast. I understand that there's lots of anxiety back home. I understand that it is very unsettling to see what is happening in the US. But at the same time, we need to be meeting with many different countries, because we need to create new alliances. And I said that in a speech a year and a half ago, but now it's in full display, and we're on it.